So the ingredients that we're going to need for our gummies are pretty much the same as the original. You're going to want 2 packages of the Jello. This is the 3 ounce, the small box, or 85 grams, whatever flavor you'd like. 2 tablespoons or 2 packages of unflavored gelatin. So 2 packages of those Knox unflavored gelatin. A half a cup of water, room temperature. And a half a cup of water, ice cold. You have to have ice cold water to bloom gelatin. We're going to want a 1/4 cup of light corn syrup. For those of you who do not like corn syrup, you can use invert sugar, glucose, honey, or agave. You just need a syrup in there. And what it does is it creates a barrier between your sugar crystals so that they don't come back together. That's why it's needed. Some type of syrup. We are going to need a 1/4 cup of cannabutter, a 1/4 teaspoon of citric acid, a half a teaspoon of guar gum, and guar gum is an emulsifier which allows us to bring oil and water together because, as everybody knows, they are mortal enemies. So in order for them to be able to become friends, you use an emulsifier, and what an emulsifier will do is it takes each molecule, a water molecule and an oil, they go in together in a bubble, and it creates a bubble around those 2 molecules. So it creates its own it creates an emulsion. That's what it does. And that's what an emulsion is bringing oil and water together to be a uniform liquid. You cannot use xanthan gum. It is not an emulsifier. It is a thickener and it is a stabilizer. It is not an emulsifier. Guar gum is an emulsifier, a stabilizer, and a thickener, as well as it has a natural gummy texture to it, which helps with your gummies. And for those of you who don't use it or can't get it, you can use soy. It would be 1 teaspoon of soy or sunflower lecithin. The other reason why I like the guar gum is it has no flavor, whereas lecithin does, and I don't like the flavor of lecithin. In substitute of water, if you want to add a little bit more flavor boost, you can use these Kool-Aid jammers or the Kool-Aid waters, or basically any juice that doesn't contain real fruit. If you do use a juice that has real fruit, you have to use a mold inhibitor, like there's the Lorraine's mold inhibitor. And that is a must. Otherwise, they will go moldy in a couple of weeks. Then, this is optional. This Alcool or Everclear, the 94% alcohol or grain alcohol, really cool trick I learned with this, which you'll have to wait till the end to see it. But yeah. This is an option, or if you make tincture, you can use your tincture, provided it is made with the high percentage alcohol. It has to be the 94-ish, around there. For flavorings, you can use the Lorraine flavor oils. Today I'm going to be making lemon raspberry, so I'm going to start with a lemon base, split it up, split out half raspberry, and make the other half lemon, and make them look all pretty. Gel food coloring. Now, if you want to create a solid background, white food coloring. A thing with this, you can only use 1 or 2 drops. If you use too much, your gummies will not set. No matter what, you can freeze them, doesn't matter what you do, they will not set if you use too much. Very important, 1 or 2 drops only. And I think I've got all the ingredients here covered. Let's get into that equipment and then let's get these made. Alright, so the equipment that we are going to need is basically the same as the old recipe. There is one major difference. We are going to throw away the immersion stick or the hand blender. That apparently is a very bad thing for our gelatin. So on top of creating a mountain of air bubbles so that your gummies don't turn out nice and clear, it also breaks the gelatin. So for any of you who have this white goopy stuff on the top of your candies, the silicone spatula or silicone whisk is going to resolve that issue. So we're not going to use the hand blender. Silicone only. Metal will damage the gelatin. Who knew it was such a delicate little flower? So silicone spatula, very important. Silicone or wooden spoon, a little strainer, or a bigger one if you've got one, doesn't have the small one, a small saucepan. Heavy bottom is preferable and non-heat transfer, which means when you look at the bottom of your pot, there is no discoloring. It's always one even. If it is discolored in spots, it means that your pot gets hotter in those particular areas and it can damage your product. So heavy bottom, non-heat transfer is the best thing to go for you. Of course, your gummy molds. These bottles are one of the best for dispersing your, dispensing your syrup into the molds. They're by Sweet Sugar Bell, and 2 reasons I like is because it uses the decorating tips, which makes it nice, as well as they have a very deep lip to them, whatever you call this, a lip screw thing. If you use the dollar store ones or ones that have the really short neck on them, then you're more likely the lid's going to pop off. Because the syrup is warm, there's not a lot, well, the pressure on it, it just pops them off. So fair warning. Either that or one of these candy funnels works great as well. Or the little dropper things that some of those molds come with. You're going to need some parchment paper and a drying rack. I think I have most of the equipment covered. You know me, I always forget something. So let's jump right into those ingredients and let's get this made. So on to making our candies. So the very first thing we want to do is to bloom our gelatin. So I've got my 2 tablespoons of gelatin here, and you want to sprinkle it onto your ice cold water. And as I said, for gelatin to bloom correctly, water has to be ice very, very, very cold. So we just want to sprinkle it across the top, so this way it doesn't clump. And then you're going to stir it into the water, make sure it's well mixed in, and that there's no lumps. Now, one tip for you, when you're doing this with your unflavored gelatin, while you're mixing it, it should start to form into the texture of applesauce. If it doesn't, then you need to add a little bit more gelatin. Either your gelatin is not as strong or used a little too much water, or whatever it is, it's probably not going to be quite enough. So like this is just a little too soupy, so I'm going to add in just a sprinkle. There we go. So that's more the texture that you want. See? Like applesauce. And then I usually toss mine into the fridge until I need it. So I've added my 2 boxes of Jello to my pot already. And then in goes our light corn syrup, or whatever syrup you choose to use. And yes, you can use Canna syrup. And our other half a cup of water. Now, this is one thing I learned. The citric acid does not go in till the end. So you never add your citric acid while you're preparing. Once everything's done and heated, that's when you add in your citric acid. The acid works like acid. It melts things. So it interferes with the cooking or the setting process if you add it in too early. Same thing if you use the cooked version. Make sure to only add it once you're done. So once you've got your water and your corn syrup and your Jello in the pot, you just want to get her mixed and turn your heat on to low. So we don't need to use a double boiler as long as you keep it on low or minimum. You're good. If you start to see any white streaking, take it off the heat immediately. So you're just going to continue to stir this until the sugar and everything is dissolved. Okay, so I've been stirring on low heat here for about 10 minutes. So we're pretty much done. So you look at the bottom there and you can see it's nice and clear. And when you stream it, it looks clear. So now that portion is done. We are going to get our unflavored gelatin. Now that our Jello and our corn syrup and that is done, we are now, we turned off our heat. This is when we're going to add in our citric acid. So a 1/4 teaspoon of citric acid. And again, citric acid is what prevents your sugar from crystallizing. right? Essentially it's an acid and it continues to melt things. There is such a science in chemistry with sugar and water and acids and stuff. It's like, wow, mind-blowing. So, 1/4 teaspoon of citric acid in there. Give her a little gentle stir. So next goes in our unflavored gelatin. What I like to do is to cut it up into little squares. Makes it easier to melt. And so we're just going to let them sit there for just a minute or so. And then you just want to gently stir until the unflavored gelatin is all completely melted. Then once your gelatin is all melted and everything is a uniform color and texture, that's how you know everything's melted and nice skins come together. Everybody's being friends in the pot. Now we're going to add our canna butter and our guar gum. So in goes our butter. Half a teaspoon of our gum. And I use a strainer so that it'll evenly distribute it over the butter. Otherwise it can clump up. And as well, you want to make sure to sprinkle it onto the butter part and not the candy syrup. Because again, if it hits the syrup part, it'll clump. The oil or the butter will make it melt. It's a pretty wild ingredient, I have to admit. We're just going to get that evenly sprinkled over our butter. And we're going to let that sit for 1 minute. Alright, after it's been sitting there for about a minute, we're going to start to whisk this. Now, you don't want to go crazy whisking because, as I said, too hard breaks our gelatin. It is going to break it a little bit, but we don't want to go too gentle because we actually have to create, be able to break that oil down small enough so that it can create an emulsion. So it's finding that happy medium. So I just kind of get it started here. So we're trying to whisk with minimal air bubbles. And then we have a look and take a look at the top and see if you see any kind of oil slick. If you do, continue to whisk it a little bit longer and then check it again. If you still see some oil coming up to the top, you see some oil slicks happening, we can add in a little bit more guar gum. But this time you're not going to add it directly into the pot. Just get your bowl that your butter was in. There's enough oil in there to deal with it. And we're just going to take a little bit, like about 1/8 of a teaspoon. And you stir it into the oil, into the butter. It dissolves the guar gum. Otherwise, as I said, if you just dump that in now, it'll just lump up. Once it's dissolved into there, add it in, like so, and whisk it again. Again, have a look. So here I've got some air bubbles. We have a little bit of our gelatin broken a little bit, but nowhere near like when we use the hand blender. Much nicer. So now that we have this as our base here, now is when we can add our flavors and our color. So as I said, I wanted to do lemon raspberry. So I'm going to split this off to half. That's about right. So for this side, I'm going to add just a little bit more lemon. And to this side, I'm going to add in our raspberry. It's probably a little too much raspberry. And we're going to add in our colors. So I'm going to keep the yellow. Which one do I want to keep clear? I think I'll keep the yellow clear, and I'm going to make the red solid. So as I said, if you've got the white food coloring, you have to shake it up really, really well. If it sits on the sits in your cupboard, it has a tendency to separate. So you really want to mix it well. Otherwise, it leaves little white dots. So, that might have been a little too much. I was only supposed to do a couple drops. A little heavy-handed. And so I'm going to whisk this one together. Oh, needs red food coloring. pretty color. Now, because I'm pretty sure I've added too much white, like I said, you only got to add in 1 or 2 drops because I kind of went a little heavy-handed. Likely this red isn't going to set. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to quick test it. I'm going to put a little bit into a dish. I'm going to throw this into the fridge for a couple of minutes to see if it sets up. If it doesn't, I'm going to add some additional gelatin to that side. All right, so my little test here, it's setting up. That was just a couple minutes in the fridge. We're setting no problem. Now, if you'd have done that and it was still sticking to your finger, then you would want to add about a half a tablespoon of additional unflavored bloom gelatin. So you would bloom half a tablespoon to 3 tablespoons of cold water and add it to the solid side. But we're good. And I went ahead and I added my yellow to my yellow side here. And now what I'm going to just do is I'm going to let them sit for just a couple of minutes and allow the air bubbles to come up to the top and that white icky stuff to come, and we can pull that out before we pour it into our bottles. So our syrup's now it's been sat for a little bit and is cooled off, and you can see kind of that layer on top here. Take your strainer and just very gently scoop that out. So this is the kind of the air bubble, a little bit of the broken gelatin. But we can get a lot of that out before we put it in the bottle. And then with your strainer, and you just want to hold it over the bottle and pour your syrup into the bottle. Oof, dead on that one, not bad. And now we're ready to cast our candies. So a tip for you, put your molds into your freezer before you start. That way they're nice and cold and your gelatin, your syrup will start to solidify right away, especially if you're doing 2 colors. That way they won't all bleed together. Another tip for you, before you pour, turn your bottles upside down, put your fingers over the tips and just tap them. What this will do is bring all the air bubbles to the top or to the bottom of the bottles. So again, helps make it much nicer candy. Okay. Then, whoop. And then just fill up your molds. Now, one thing important with your molds is don't fill them all the way to the top. You want to go just below it. Go all the way to the top. It creates a ridge. That gets icky. It gets hard. These guys are going to look so cool. Yellow on yellow is tough. It's hard to see it, especially when it's clear. So this recipe will make about 100 or so of this size mold that I'm using, probably about 300 of the teeny tinies, and probably about 50, 60 of the larger size. All right, so my gummies are set. Get your cooling rack, your drying rack, parchment paper, line your rack, and just pop out your gummies. Now, if you can stand them up, if they'll stand up, better. But if not, just lay them down, and then after about 12 hours, flip them and let them fully dry out. I usually flip them a couple times a day. I walk by and give them a flip. And these guys will take about 24 to 48 hours to fully dry out. And you want to make sure that you have a dry place. Humidity will not help your candies dry out at all. Drying and humid do not work together. So if you do have a humid place, if you can get a dehumidifier, that will greatly help you out. So I'm just going to finish uncasting these little guys. And I'm going to go into the next step and show you the little trick with the alcohol and what that does, and then how to successfully sugar sour coat your candies. So be sure to stay tuned. Okay, so this is the size of the candies when you take them out of the mold, and that's the size of the candies once they dry. So they shrink there a little bit there. All right, so here's a trick that I learned, a tip that I learned, and it's going to make your lives a whole lot easier, especially for those of you guys who ship and who are having troubles with your candy sticking together. what you're going to do is you're going to take your Everclear or your Everclear or Alcool, depending on where you're from. Anyway, your 94 or up percentage alcohol. Put it into a small spray bottle. Remember the equipment that I always forget to tell you? Small spray bottle is one of them. So put your alcohol into a small spray bottle. So we want to give our candies a bit of a generous spray here. And then just mix them up. Let the alcohol get into all the candy all over. And again, if you can do this with tincture, if you've got your tincture, provided you did it with the high-grade alcohol. And once you do that, just put them out, flip them up, and let the alcohol evaporate. It takes about 20 minutes or so, and that's it. It creates creates a bit of a barrier. It keeps your candies chewier for a longer period of time. So I've had these guys out for about 4 days, and see, they're still perfectly squishy and gummy and not dried out looking or anything. And that's what the alcohol helps to do. And it also prevents them from sticking together. All right, so the next part is how to successfully sugarcoat your gummies. All right, so this is the really other cool thing that I learned, how to successfully coat our candies. So for the most part, you've taken them out, you coated them, they melted, it gets ugly. We're not happy, because that's because we're doing it wrong. The reason is citric acid, as I said, is an acid. If there is any moisture, it is going to cause it to melt. So that's what's happening is you take your candies out of the fridge, it's warmer outside of your room temperature. It automatically creates moisture from cold to warm. Well, if you just automatically put your candies in or there's any moisture, the citric acid will melt. So in order to successfully coat them so they don't, what you want to do is once your candies are fully dried after a couple of days, and if you do the step with the alcohol coating and they're done, take your candies, take a drying rack, and just spread them out onto the drying rack. Then you're going to get your pot of boiling water here, and we're going to just hold the rack over the steam. Just move it around so our candy's getting steamed up here, and we don't burn our hands. So what we're doing here is we're creating them, we're giving them a little bit of a heat steam melt to create a bit of tackiness, and then our candies stick and they don't melt. So once they feel kind of gooey, a little bit gooey there, doesn't take very long, just dump them into your sugar mix. Now, for the most part, you do about a cup of sugar to a quarter teaspoon or so of the citric acid, and then taste that. These guys didn't get steamed. And give that a taste and see how you like it. Then just add a little bit at a time till you get the desired sourness that you would like. Or you can just sugarcoat them. You don't have to do the sour. So once they're done, you put them in the bowl, mix them all up, get your rack, parchment paper. I don't have enough room. I so need a bigger table. Then just shake off your excess. And if there's any ones that didn't get coated, just hold them over the steam. And that's it. Onto the rack. They're pretty much ready to go. They take about 20 minutes to dry, fully dry out, and that's it. You will have your sugar coating that will not melt. Neat. And there you have them. Nicely coated, sugar sour coated gummies that aren't going to melt on you. Alright guys, so that's everything I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed that video even though it was a do-over, but good side is you did get to learn a couple of new things that should greatly improve your candies. Alright, so once again, thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope you have an awesome rest of your day.